All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. First, I want to give a huge thank you to Shannon and Cody and Bart. I've been doing work in digital health for a very long time, like before the iPhone, and I've always joked that anytime I'm going to talk about this stuff, I'm guaranteed to have some technical difficulty. Today, that technical difficulty was that my laptop did not charge overnight. That would be the laptop that was the only place that my talk was located, and it was dead. So thank you for the heroics of Shannon, Bart, and Cody. And you all should thank them as well, because otherwise I would have been left to give this talk as an interpretive dance, and nobody wants to see that. So this morning, I am really excited to talk with you about what it's like to talk about SDT in non-academic settings. I work for a digital health tech company, and so most of the time the audiences that I'm interacting with have no idea what SDT is. And so I wanted to take the opportunity to talk with you about what that experience is like, and also to encourage you to step outside the walls of your academic institutions, because there are lots of great places for SDT to be applied, and it's really helpful for those of us who know this theory to be out in the world sharing, as it were, the good news. There were some alternative titles to this talk. Lessons learned from my life working outside of academia. Also, please, 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 don't make me keep talking about nudge, behavioral economics, tiny habits, and gamification. Because let me tell you, I talk a lot about those things, and part of it is because we as an SDT community haven't taken the opportunity to share this out in ways that are really digestible for the masses. So, what is this talk even about? Buckle up your seatbelts, because we're going to cover a lot of material in very little time. I'm going to talk about how we talk about SDT principles with diverse audiences, some of the differences between academic and industry approaches to developing products and doing research, what it looks like to implement SDT in a digital solution. So I'm going to provide some examples from a product that I've been working on over the last 2-ish years. And I'll end with some opportunities for where we need to use SDT now, both in academic research and also out in the world in application settings. So let's get started with how we talk about SDT. This is a really important opportunity for us as scientists to do a better job with communication. So you're all familiar with the motivation continuum, and you're familiar with these words. Now, for those of you who are relatively new to SDT, or perhaps are a little more early in your career, you might remember very clearly the first time you saw this continuum and this collection of words. These words are complicated. These words are, some cases, made up words that one cannot find in the dictionary and that do not respond very well to spell check. So imagine, if you will, that you're speaking to an audience who has never heard anything at all about SDT. If this is what you lead with, they will look confused and possibly look at you like you've got 3 heads. Then, just to make things that much more interesting, we add in basic psychological needs. Now, most people understand the concept of competence, and the way we have defined it in SDT is aligned with how it is defined in common vernacular. People know this word, and they know that it means this. They don't know this word and that it means this. When we talk about autonomy in SDT, we're talking about something very different than what most people assume. And this is why, in Rich's remarks earlier in the conference, he talked about what autonomy is not. When I'm pitching to a client, I don't have the time to explain what autonomy is not. I have a very short window where I'm able to talk with people about what the major concepts are. And if people get tripped up on a word like this and they're like, well, I can't just let my employees do whatever they want, then I've lost the conversation. This word also trips people up. People know what it means to relate to another person, but they don't understand sort of practically what does relatedness mean. And so this is another word that can sometimes trip people up, and it's often hard for people to connect the dots between how relatedness might translate to behavior. So the key here is that we have to know our audiences. When I'm talking with all of you, I can use all of these words. I can say amotivation and introjection and autonomy, and you all know what I'm talking about. But in my daily life, in the people that I'm working with, both my colleagues and the clients that I'm talking to, they don't know those words. And so I have had to develop different ways of talking about the concepts, because what matters here really is the concepts and how we help those concepts to really land and resonate with our audiences. So here's how I've been talking about the motivation continuum. We start with the foundation that motivation is psychological energy. And that's a really important message to carry out into the world, because people use the word motivation all the time with not a lot of thought for what they're talking about. So we start with the idea that motivation is psychological energy. And if motivation is psychological energy, that's great, because A, it allows us to think about energy always existing. You don't have to create something out of nothing. But then we also have to think about what's the quality of that motivation. And so an analogy that I've found rings really well with people is this difference between junk versus quality motivation. Food is also energy, and there are types of food that you can eat that will give you a quick hit, but then you crash. Motivation works the same way. So when I talk about these two types of motivation, junk versus quality motivation, this stuff is going to look real familiar to you. I don't call this external regulation. I call this carrots and sticks, because this is what that's about, and people get that concept intuitively. And so here we talk about the kinds of things that all of us talk about when we talk about external motivation. I'm just not using that terminology. I'm using the terminology that really connects with people. I really enjoyed Nikki Lee Gates' talk yesterday, and I'm going to totally poach her description of reactance as the screw you effect, because I think that also helps people to really get it very well. And I think what really captures people's attention, again, when you're talking with people who want to design a health solution, or they want their employees to quit smoking, or they want their patients to lose weight, they know that they need something that's going to last long term. And when you let them know that when you're pulling on these carrots and sticks, you're just going to get short-term engagement, and that ultimately you're going to get people to bail, they get that. And it also resonates with them that if you're going to design an incentive structure where you're paying people or throwing confetti at them or giving them points for every little thing, you're going to have to keep increasing that over time. That also speaks their language, because they don't have the bottom line to be able to handle that. I also really appreciate being able to draw from the great philosopher Carrie Bradshaw from Sex and the City when I'm talking about motivation. And again, this is another way to help people understand what really is introjection. Introjection is about that inner critic. And here, this is where it's not that you've got external rewards and punishments, this is when you're inflicting it on yourself. You get ego involvement. Well, ego involvement's kind of a jargony word, so how do I talk about that? I talk about that as a roller coaster. When people are ego involved in the face of success, they are flying high. They feel amazing. But in the face of failure, they feel terrible. They have lots of feelings of guilt and shame. And so if you are creating a context where people are going to feel guilt or feel shameful, you might get people to do what you want them to do in the short term. But ultimately, it only works for a little while, and it's mostly making people feel awful. So then we get to quality forms of motivation. I talk a little bit about intrinsic motivation. It is the promised land. And people know the term intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. That's something that's pretty common out in the world. But one of the things that they often don't think about is they do tend to think in terms of extrinsic motivation bad, intrinsic motivation good. And that's a simplified way of thinking of it. There are obviously quality forms of external motivation. And ultimately, this form of motivation, as we all know, is very self-sustaining, provided that really well-intentioned others don't muck it up. But then I always have to deliver this bad news, and that's because I work in the field of health and health behavior. And the reality is that most of the things we're asking people to do in health and health behavior are not intrinsically motivating. It is not inherently satisfying to have a colon cancer screening. and yet people need to do it. It's not particularly enjoyable to quit smoking. It's really hard. So if we can't be relying on intrinsic motivation, what can we do? And that brings us to this other form of motivation. I'm not going to split hairs over identified versus integrated, because that's not going to serve the purpose with my audience. But I am gonna say, like, one of the things that we can do a really good job of is helping people to tap into personal meaning and a sense of personal values and how they think of themselves as a person. And this is what you see. So this, particularly when we think about the way that health behavior change is often delivered through health systems, there tends to be a lot of shoulding and also a lot of prescribing. So it's like, here is your plan, here are your goals. When people are delivered a package, it's really hard for them to get this buy-in. But there's a way to do that that allows the person to have a better sense of personal endorsement, and also for the person to connect what they're doing for their health to the other things that really matter for their lives. Because frankly, a lot of times their health isn't what matters most to them in the moment. We still get long-term engagement out of this. And importantly, these types of motivation, as you all well know, create flexible thinking and persistence in the face of failure. And I think this is really critical because most of what we're talking about in health and health behavior is, first of all, not linear. People have fits and starts all the time. They try a thing, they do it for a few days, a few weeks, maybe even a few months, and then they get tripped up. We need people to keep coming back, and that's something that really resonates with businesses because they're spending a lot on people's healthcare in the US because we're Byzantine and we do not supply healthcare to all people. Or it's something that certainly matters to health plans because healthier people are cheaper to insure. And we want people to keep trying so that they ultimately get to those behaviors we want to deliver on. So that's how I talk about the motivation continuum, junk versus quality motivation. How do I talk about basic psychological needs? Because of course the next logical question is, that all sounds great, how do I make that magic happen? So here I talk not about basic psychological needs because that can be a little bit overwhelming to people. I talk about what builds quality motivation. What does quality motivation stand on? Competence, again, don't need to do a whole lot to that because that's something that really makes sense to people. But here I often will talk about the importance of feeling stretched but not strained. If something is way too easy for a person to do, particularly something like in physical activity or making changes to their diet or even setting a goal like reducing how much they smoke cigarettes, if people are only making those changes in teeny tiny increments that don't feel at all challenging, that's not going to get them going. But if it's too hard the other direction, they're also not going to get going. So we have to try to find a way to hit that sweet spot for people to feel like, oh, I can do this, and this is a little harder than what I'm used to, but it's not impossible. Because the word autonomy is such a loaded word and it trips people up, I've found that using the word ownership helps a lot. People want to be doing the stuff that they believe in, that matters to them, and they want to feel personally invested in the process and the goals that they're setting. Relatedness is really about connection. And I think there are a couple of pieces here that we really haven't explored in the scientific literature that are really useful to think about. So the first is kind of the more traditional way that we think about relatedness and connection, and that is about feeling understood, about having by important others, about feeling like you're not being judged for the fact that you can't execute it perfectly all the time. But I think there's another piece in here, and that is how the self is connected to itself, because I think this might be the key to kind of quieting that inner critic a little bit, and I'll talk about that in just a moment with some examples. So real briefly, I want to touch on some of the key differences between academia and digital health in terms of just how we work, not just the language we use, but how we do what we do. And if this is something that's of interest to you, I would love for you all to come this evening at 5:30 to the brainstorming session that Jen LaGuardia will be leading, and I get to be her sidekick in that experience. This is not going to be a traditional brainstorming session. Instead, think of this as more sort of like a professional development experience. If you have ever wondered what it's like to work outside of academia and to work in a digital health industry setting, we want to talk with you about that. We want to answer your questions. We want to share what we've learned with our experiences working there. So here's a little teaser on what we'll be talking about this evening. When we are working in industry, it is not at all helpful for us to be wringing our hands and wailing that we've been studying this for 40 some odd years and yet we just don't know. That turns out to be a terrible sales pitch. And there's a lot we do know. And so when we are working in these contexts, we are seeing what's out there in the available evidence. What do we know about SDT? What do we know about applications of SDT? How do we bring that to life? Have we done this exact application in an RCT? No, not yet. And that's okay, because we're probably not going to make people worse. And that is really where we're starting from. Measuring outcomes. When we do clinical trials in industry, and we do clinical trials in industry, we have a bit more latitude to ask people questions. But under none of those circumstances are we able to hold people hostage to answer 32 items just about motivation. And so a lot of times we're having to go with qualitative indicators, or we're having to go with much more abbreviated measures. And for those of you who are way into psychometrics, God bless you, please write us a brief motivation inventory that we can use in these settings. The pace of things is also very different in industry. We are typically working by quarter and by half of the year or by a full year, where we're developing something to a prototype or what we call an MVP. This is a minimally viable product. We'll talk more about what a minimally viable product means, but basically you're just gonna have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable with we're not going to build the perfect thing out the gates. We're gonna build something that's good enough to try right now, and then we'll iterate on it. So the first build is not the stopping point. And that's a big difference between academics and industry too, because often in academia, you're tied to a grant funding cycle. And that requires that you build the best thing you possibly can with the minimal dollars that you have in the timeline that you have, and we aren't under those same types of constraints in academia, so we can build an initial version of something, see what works, see what doesn't work, and tweak from there. All right, so more on that this evening. Come join us. How do you even do this? How do you take principles of SDT and put them into practice in a digital solution? So Pivot is the product that I've been working on over the last couple of years with my company, Carrot. It's a branding thing. I can't explain this. Why we have a company named one thing, a product named another thing, they didn't ask me. So let me tell you a little bit about Pivot. Pivot is a smoking cessation program. We intentionally are recruiting people who are all smokers. Like, you don't have to be ready to quit. The first thing you do in our program is not setting a quit date. We want to provide support for people along the motivational continuum. We have a piece of hardware that measures exhaled carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is one of the metabolites of cigarette smoking. When you're smoking combustible products, that's something you exhale. This is a way to sort of give people the quantified self, but it's also a really nice way for people to see this is what's happening in my body right now, not hypothetically 30 years from now you might get lung cancer, which, as you might imagine, isn't particularly motivating. We have an app that delivers evidence-based principles around both smoking cessation and human behavior change. You might imagine that since yours truly was in charge of writing most of the content, that it's very well steeped in principles of SDT, and that is one way that you can infuse SDT principles into a digital solution, is not only through the content of a mobile application, but also through the voice of that product. There is a cultural experience that you have within an app and the way it interacts with you, the way it responds to you. I've been a longtime user of the app Runkeeper. Anyone else use Runkeeper? This week, I completed a run with some friends, and I learned that it was the 167th fastest run I had done in the 6 to 8 mile range. I don't know how many. Is it 167 out of 168? Is it 167 out of 500? I don't know. That piece of information wasn't included. That is a tone and voice that is coming at me from that app. It's not particularly ideal. So these are things that you can have say in when you are part of the process of building an app. We have dedicated coaches. So not only do you have the technology pieces, you also have the opportunity to work one-on-one with a coach. And we've used a dedicated coaching model. And so what that means is that if you are a participant in our program, every time you interact with a coach, you are interacting with the same human being every single time. And this allows you to set up a quality relationship with that coach. I've also been responsible for running our coaching organization, and that has included training of our coaches. So of course, that has also involved principles of SDT. So they're getting the Kool-Aid from all ends in this experience. We also provide nicotine replacement therapy medications because that is something that is evidence-based and we know makes it much more likely for people to be able to quit. So that's an overview of the program. I want to focus here right now on some examples of how we support basic psychological needs for kind of the three main components of our program: the carbon monoxide breath sensor, the mobile application, and coaching. So this is our first generation carbon monoxide breath sensor. Just this month, we launched our second generation sensor, but I couldn't find any pictures of it, so unfortunately I don't have that here. But this is an activity that people do in the app about the use of the sensor. You'll see lots of good examples here of how this might support autonomy. We start with why. Why should you even track this? Why does it matter? And we wanted to break things down for people. A lot of times people have carbon monoxide sensors in their homes, and so they have the sense that like, oh, carbon monoxide is bad. But we want to let them know how smoking and carbon monoxide are connected, again, so that they have enough of an understanding of this that they have the so what. So here we're providing a rationale. You'll see on the far right, we have what is affectionately and technically referred to as the guy. And as you are using the breath sensor over time, the guy starts to fill with CO. So you have an idea of how much exposure you've had to CO over the course of a day. And we provide people with information on their last breath sample, and kind of where they've been so far. Now, what happens when a person quits smoking is that they're also able to continue using the breath sensor, and what they see there is that they're blowing green because their carbon monoxide levels have gone down. And so the guy stops filling with red at that point and starts filling with green. So again, another way to provide some informational feedback so people know where they stand. We also want to provide opportunities for people to try things out. It takes people on average somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 quit attempts before they successfully quit smoking. So we start with the assumption that most of the people who come to our program this is not their first rodeo. They've tried to quit before. And so chances are their competence might have taken a bit of a hit in that experience because they've tried and they've failed. And they're like, maybe I'm just not good at this. And the other thing that's crazy is that every smoker knows somebody who woke up on some random Tuesday and decided, I'm done with this, and voila, they were done. Now, what really happened for that person is that they tried 15 times before and there was something about that Tuesday that worked for them, but they never tell that story. The story they tell is, I quit cold turkey on a Tuesday 5 years ago and have never gone back. So people are walking around with, I couldn't do this, other people can do this, what's wrong with me? So we want to create opportunities for people to rebuild that competence. And so this is one of the things that we have offered in our program. We have daily challenges that people can complete. And the idea here is for people to have little chunks of things that they can try out and see how they're going and kind of go from there. And the idea is that they can make those kind of iterative improvements, celebrate small successes, and again, start to rebuild that feeling that they're capable of doing this really challenging thing. And finally, within the context of coaching, we provide an opportunity for people to experience relatedness. So here you'll see a sample of 2 coaching conversations between one of our coaches and a user. These are real coaching conversations. I did not make these up. And one of the things that we have found is really helpful to ask people early on in their experience with Pivot is, tell me something that you want me to know about you and smoking, or tell me something that you feel like other people don't get about you and smoking. There is a ton of social shame and stigma in the US around smoking. Part of that is an unintended consequence of the really positive public health gains that we've made in smoking rates in the US over the last 50 years. But basically people feel like they're being treated like they have a nasty habit and they don't have enough willpower, and nobody really talks to them about smoking for the purpose that it is serving in their lives. And starting from that place of saying, I get you and I see you, and I want to know I want you to know that I understand you're doing this, not because you're weak-willed, but because it's helping you in some way. And this really opens the door to establishing really quality relationships with a coach, because this is one of the very first experiences that they have with their coach coming into the program. It's not about setting a quit date. It's help me to understand you and why smoking is doing something in your life. As I mentioned earlier, I think one of the areas where we really have an opportunity to tap relatedness is also around how we quiet the inner critic. And so one of the things that we do in our app is once a person reaches their quit day, we have these kind of daily or weekly check-ins where a person can let us know kind of how things are going for them. And one of the things that we want to do is we want to normalize that smoking is hard and that slips and relapses are part of the process. And so if you fall, it's okay. We're here to catch you, help you dust yourself off, and get back in the game. And so part of what we're trying to do here is not only, again, create that voice of unconditional positive regard in our app experience, but we are also trying to help quiet that inner critic that has that person telling themselves, there's something wrong with me. Why can't I do this? I've failed again. So I've shown you all of these things. Do we know if it's doing anything? So I wanted to share with you some quotes from some of our participants, some of our actual users. And I just want to highlight a couple of these quotes. So I think what I really liked about this first quote, for me, the most useful way to use the app is to come to the app and choose my own adventure based on how I'm feeling, what was happening today. Do I need some support, or do I want to build my profile more? So here, what we're hearing from this person is there is a structure that is provided within Pivot that lets me choose what I need to do today based on my needs. It's not a free-for-all. There is a structure there, but this person knows that they can come to the app, and if they need a pick-me-up, if they need some support, they can reach out to their coach. Or if they want to start building their skills a little bit more, they can go in and do that. Here, I want to highlight, the woman on the left. The coach was a big thing because she saw in me what I wasn't seeing. It's really nice to get a pat on the back from somebody. And I love that quote. It gives me chills every time I read it because this is clearly a person who hasn't been feeling particularly capable. And what she experienced in her work with her coach was somebody seeing her, and not only seeing her, but seeing the potential that was in her. And that's a really beautiful thing, and something that I am personally really proud of our coaches for being able to embody and communicate to people. All of this is done digitally. They are talking with people via text message. It's a chat feature, and this was her experience in that. So, lest you think we're doing all of this by the seat of our pants, we do, in fact, have 2 publications that have come out over the last 6 months or so. The first was a feasibility study looking at, are people actually using all of the features that we have in this? Are they staying engaged, at least in the short term? Spoiler, yes. And both of these articles are available open access in the Journal of Medical Internet Research, so please feel free to look them up or shoot me an email. We also did an initial assessment. This was a traditional clinical trial. We had IRB approval, the whole 9, of looking at how people engage with our program over the course of the first 3 months or so. We had really good quit rates. I will say that right now we aren't measuring motivation and those types of things. We are measuring primarily smoking cessation outcomes. So, last bit here. Where do we need SDT most in digital health? What's broken and how can we in SDT help fix it? And I think it's here. It is in the space of amotivation. Amotivation has long been this thing that we sweep to the side in the theory, and it is a thing that we bump up against again and again and again in health and healthcare settings. People are overwhelmed with what's going on in their lives. We're asking them to make very complex changes. We're asking them to disrupt what is working for them in their lives, and we don't necessarily have fantastic tools for understanding why is a person in this space? Why is the person not feeling especially motivated? And based on that information, what are the right levers for us to pull from SDT? If somebody is feeling deflated because they've tried and failed a gazillion times, then it makes sense to throw some skills building at them. But too often we're just throwing skills building at people when that may in fact not at all be the problem. And so I think we have a really important opportunity here to really understand amotivation, to start to study it intentionally, and to figure out kind of when do we push which levers in need support, when do we want to try to, what profiles of people are most susceptible to which types of support. That's all I got.